to the Robert Jackson Center. This is great.
Thank you.
Don, what's hometown for you?
Elmira, New York.
So you were born there?
Born there, graduated from high school, EFA high school, 42.
Mm-hmm. And what'd your mom and dad do?
Dad was a Methodist minister.
Mm-hmm.
Went to Asbury College and seminary in the 20s, and became a minister. I think he had his elder papers in 27. Retired in 1971. In the war years, he was a chaplain in the Navy for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Stayed in the reserves afterwards, and 65 retired. Today's mother and he are died. He died, and they're buried in Arlington Cemetery.
Because of this military background, you graduated in 1942, and was the draft, were you a draftee or an enlisted person?
Well, I had a draft card. I was able to plan for college, so I went to college, Tri-State College in Angola, Indiana, mm-hmm. and with the draft card in my hand, and there was an Army airfield at Bearfield, Fort Wayne, Indiana. So some of us decided that we better enlist. Maybe we'd get a little more college time in before they called us up. So 4 of us went down in October, I think it was, 42 to enlist. We were able to get 2 more quarters of college in before May of 43 we were called up. And so I was called up in the Army. Mm-hmm. Wearing glasses in those days, I was limited service, they called it. So I was shipped to Camp Roberts, California for duty and for basic training. Roberts was in the desert.
Right.
Temperatures in the daytime 115 and 120. At nighttime in the 40s. Completed that since my AGCT score was high enough to both OCS and Army Specialized Training Program.
By the way, just for the film, AGCT.
Army General Aptitude Test, something like that.
Yeah.
So I elected to go. I could either go to Officer Candidate School or to Army Specialized Training. I elected Army Specialized Training and ended up at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. Got 6 months of training there. Mm-hmm. I lived in a fraternity house. And following the war, I was going, and it wasn't going well in Africa, then in going into the Mediterranean area and into Italy. And nobody told us, but I think the losses were so heavy that they decided to cancel the program because there were hundreds of men in this training program at colleges and universities. And so my guess is that they said back into the trenches. So we were closed out and moved back into a replacement depot, and I was sent to 11th Armored Division at Camp Cook, now Vandenberg Air Force Base, for the 11th Armored Division training. So I was in what was it? It was 11th Armored Division, and I forget what the combat command was. I was in headquarters of combat CCA, I think it was. And but anyhow, we had all kinds of trainings through the sand. And one day we were detailed to go to a beach beach invasion exercise, sitting in a foxhole in the cold sand. And the next day when we got back and got home, I didn't feel well. The following day I had a temperature and couldn't move my left knee. So I had what they diagnosed as cellulitis and shipped me off to the base hospital. Meantime, the 11th Armored Division moved out, went to New York and shipped over to England, became part of the invasion. Mm-hmm. And when I healed and got well enough, there were 3 armored divisions being assembled and trained, 14th, 16th, and 20th, kind of to back up the ones that were in Europe, kind of in reserve. I was detailed to the 16th Armored Division in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Camp Chaffee. And so I ended up there, and again I was extras, and all the rank was taken up, so I was a runner and KP and all of the extra things that are no fun to do.
Right.
So we met my future wife there, Ann, wrote to her, and we went over in early, I think it was January of 45. I remember sending her a Valentine card. I was at Times Square for New Year's Eve of, what would it be, 44, 45. So we ended up going into Le Havre. All of Le Havre was bombed. We went over actually on the Countess de Savoia, which was the ex-Countess de Savoia, in a troop convoy, and it had been a French ship, and we captured it in the Indian Ocean. We had 6,500 troops on board, and 500 Army for anti-aircraft guns, because we were an armed troop transport, and the crew, I don't know, 500, 1,000 for the crew. So we were a convoy at 10 knots, took us 2 weeks to get over. We landed in Le Havre. We had to go in from floating concrete docks, offloaded in then were ducks, which were the amphibious trucks, and got into the depot, and I think they had a train running. We went into then the Normandy coast area and lived on the economy. Our officers were in the hill of the chateau, and we stayed in the barns over the cattle and the pigs. I was in the headquarters company. So we were there for, what would it be, January, rest of January, February, and on into March. Then we started moving up to the front. In March and April, we were living on the economy with German houses. And along that time,
Did you have any interaction, by the way, any interaction with the Germans as you were kind of moving to the front? You're living in German houses. Were there German kids, wives?
There weren't many around. Our headquarters was in a German house for our combat command. We asked them to move into one room, and we took over the other rooms. But there was a kind of I don't want to say neutral feeling, but there wasn't hostile feeling that we could detect.
Right.
Because the countryside they knew what was happening. They had probably letters back home and realized things weren't going well for their company, their country, and so it was kind of neutral or not too hostile. And so President Truman became the president. I remember it was in March, I think, President Roosevelt died. April, we were still there. We started moving up toward the front then in late April, early May. We got to Nuremberg. Nuremberg had been leveled with 1,000 plane raids and shelling because the Germans wouldn't leave. We took a day off and walked through the streets. We couldn't get a Jeep through the streets because it was too much debris. Many homes had black ribbons on it because they died in their homes. And so we pulled together our troops, and then our goal was, I understood, was Praha or Prague, to get to the embassy and free Czechoslovakia. Well, we got back in our Jeeps, and I was riding in a half-track and headed for Pilsen. I think it was the 6th of May, 5th in the evening. We traveled all night and refueled. In the morning, we pulled into Pilsen. About 6 in the morning, found hot coffee and food on the tables. The Germans had left, knowing we were coming. We were to go on to Prague, we thought. I was by then in communications and switchboards and telephone communications, and if you know anything about the old switchboards, you could roll a key and listen without anybody knowing. So I would roll a key occasionally and listen, and I heard that the word came through from all the way from the big boys all the way through Third Army in Munich that our limit was 5 miles east of Pilsen was as far as we could go, because the Russians were going to come to meet us. And so we thought, well, okay, we were supposed to go to Prague, but we didn't. Then we got word there were 3 German divisions marching on Pilsen. We're trying to figure out what's happening. They were forced marching on to Pilsen. We found out later, and I listened to what was happening, that they were marching to the Americans to surrender.
They didn't want to surrender to the Russians.
They didn't want to surrender to the Russians. When you go back in history, and when I got to Cornell a few years later to do work, I got back into the stacks and was reading the history, a bit of what was happening. And these three divisions were Russians in the western area of Russia who had joined the Germans, became German soldiers because they thought that the Germans were going to go straight to Moscow and wipe out the administration and free the country. So they were in German uniform. Later on I read that they had been used in the Eastern Front, guarded very carefully because they were Russians in German uniform.
Right.
So they marched to the Americans to surrender because if the Russians caught them, they were all traitors.
Sure.
So there were three divisions. The weapons were piled high as trucks. We loaded them into trailers, semi-trailers, stake body, with probably 100 each standing straight up, and hauled them back into Germany as fast as we could. And we recovered all three divisions before the Russians got there, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah.
And
What a story.
that was quite a feeling of now we're working with an unknown, because the Russians were kind of an unknown quantity. And so we later pulled back into Mariansky Lozny, which is Marienbad, or Sudetenland, which was free territory because there were hospitals, hotels turned to hospitals in that area. And we were there for a couple of months and then moved back into Pilsen, figuring that we were going to establish a 22nd Corps headquarters in Pilsen. We had an armored division and 2 infantry divisions in Austria to be occupiers. So that was in the fall of 45. Everything was going well until middle of November. We got the word that no, November 30th was the last day here. The national leaders, the big boys, had decided that the Russians would get all of Czechoslovakia and we would leave and go back into Germany. So we were quite unhappy because we had laid 5-pair cable, telephone cable for winter operation down into Austria, and so we could maintain, I was in wire work and communications, and we had to tear all that down. So we had Thanksgiving dinner. Where they found turkey and dressing, I don't know. We had Thanksgiving dinner, and a few days after that, we started packing up. Headquarters moved out. We were the last ones out of the motor pool, out of the area. We broke down our communications that day, and we went on what we had for radios. We lined up our trucks, loaded the telephone equipment into the trucks, and I became the driver of a 1.5-ton Dodge, which was a 6x. If you remember, they're 4-wheel drive Dodges, so this was a 6-wheel. And I ended up to be the last one in the convoy. I think I was the last one out of Czechoslovakia. I crossed the border at 8 o'clock in the evening back into Germany, and that took care of American occupation or activities in Czechoslovakia. So we moved into Germany. That was in now coming up December, and we were in a synthetic rayon factory on what was the famous river? Anyhow, we were on through Germany. We were there, I think, a couple of weeks, and
along the Danube.
The Danube. We had to turn our trucks in to Thionville, France. That is our communication trucks, all of our telephone trucks. So we drove across Germany and back. A little side light there coming back into Germany from France in the wintertime. This is before I got to Nuremberg. We weren't supposed to go into, I think it was Saarbrücken. We weren't supposed to go into the French occupied territory, but it's about 20 degrees out and we had no place to stay. So our sergeant said, let's go into town. So we went into town, went to a bar, and they were all speaking French. So we weren't supposed to be there, but we didn't have any place to stay. So one of the Frenchmen who spoke English said, there's an American across the street. And it didn't make sense. But we went across the street, and there was a major, an American major, and a captain, and a couple of enlisted people. And somehow we had a house in the French zone, and watching what was going on in the French zone, because the French had been some sympathetic to the Germans. We weren't sure if there was going to be a German uprising. We thought we had all the weapons and everything, but here we were in their house, this house. So the major said, you can stay with us all night. So we slept on a cold floor in the house. And the next morning we got out of the French zone, got back to our quarters in Germany. So we were then, yeah, okay. So I got back, and then they said, Ellison, you've got orders for Munich. So they signed the Jeep over to me. I got on the Autobahn, drove to Munich, checked in with I think it was the 325th Communications Battalion, which was operating 3rd Army rear. There was rear and forward. Rear handled all of the prisons and supplies, and forward handled all of the administrative and intelligence and stuff. So they said, here are your orders for Nuremberg. And I said, I just came from that area. And so I got on the Autobahn, drove back to Nuremberg, turned in the Jeep at the motor pool, signed in, got my Palace of Justice pass, and here I was working at the Nuremberg War Trials with now fairly modern communications by then. 2 trailers, one had the frames and the other had the switchboards, and they were back to back. And our switchboards then were kind of modern. We had still drop boards and ring for the long distance communication lines. We had a line to Paris, Zurich, Switzerland, Moscow, and London, direct lines, and then telephone lines in the Palace, Palace of Justice. So here I am, and now this is December of '45. I remember that because the Americans were going to have a party someplace, and all of my buddies said, we want to go to the party. He says, fine, I am not a partier. So I went, and I'll take care of the switchboards. I handled the switchboard all night. I think it was Christmas Eve. And I did the same New Year's Eve. And I had a line, and I talked to I guess she was a Wren in London, 100 feet below ground. I must talk several hours. We just chatted on the telephone, nothing else going on. Yeah. And I asked her if she had a line to the States, and she did. And I says, whoops, I better not ask for it. They'll ask my name, rank, and serial number. I will be tagged for that. So I didn't call States. I probably could have. So I talked with her all night. But in the meantime, we were on a shift for communications. Our quarters were over the administrative section in Palace of Justice. Our window, we had, I guess we had cots by then, GI mess, they brought in a mess, and our windows overlooked the prison walls where the Germans were being held.
Did you actually see the courtyard? Could you actually see them exercise?
I didn't see them exercise, but we could, I don't know that we were looking at the right time, but we could see the courtyard. But we saw the barred walls, windows of the barred walls. So we had with our pass, Palace of Justice pass, we'd go in and listen to the testimony. I didn't do that but one day, and that day was, I had off that day, and I said, I'll go see what's happening. So I went in and sat down in the balcony, and it was a French woman who had survived the concentration camp, and she was talking about, I think it was probably a French concentration camp, talking about the feeling of the people in the area around the concentration camp, seeing trains bringing people in and leaving empty, having strange odors all day long coming out of the ovens, not knowing what was happening, not daring to go near the concentration camps. And so that was kind of, her testimony was about those activities, and I don't remember what camp she was in.
She was, let me just give you a little background, because I did research a little bit of this, and it was during the time of the French prosecution. So you're probably listening with the headset.
American translation.
English. It probably was all in French.
Yes, it was in French.
And the prosecutor was a guy named Dubois, D-U-B-O-S-T. And I'll read a little bit of this, because this may put into perspective. Much of Dubois' evidence came from the German concentration camps, understood at the time as the quintessential instrument of the Nazi domination of Europe. Breaking with American strategy, the French determined to make the case at this point through witnesses. Dubois called 7 victims of concentration camps. 3 of them described Mauthausen in Austria, where many Allied prisoners of war were taken to be murdered. 2 told of Buchenwald, including accounts of so-called medical experience, and perhaps the most powerful testimony began on January 28th when Dubois called to stand an articulate woman in a dark blue suit, aged 33, Marie-Claude Valiant-Courtier, who was a veteran of the French resistance, who survived more than 3 years of Nazi tortures and abuse, mainly in Auschwitz. A witness of great stature, she was a deputy in the French Constituent Assembly. Valiant-Courtier poured out a cascade of horrors unfamiliar to the immediate post-war audience. She told of the torture and the murder of the resistance members, the unspeakable convoy to Auschwitz, the terrible regimen of the camp, the gassing of Jews, the sickness, and the medical experiments. And as you were listening to some of this testimony, what was your gut reaction? You're probably hearing things for the very first time.
Yeah, I was hearing things for the very first time, and realizing that the things we'd heard, I guess I would say, about the Nazi machine, it really happened. I didn't have any belief but what it did happen, but I didn't realize the depth of it. And it wasn't until afterwards, since I was in the occupation force on into 46, I began to see how deeply it had permeated the German civilization and the society. I can talk more about that in the occupation end of it, but it began to be really, it was evident to me that the Allied forces, I guess is the way to put it, had every right to call these people to trial because they had in fact murdered millions of people, and it was, what should I say? It was something that they should be called to account for, and it just wasn't one individual. It was the whole Nazi structure involving all facets of life that had done this thing. So it was a total movement of the youth and the younger Germans. The older Germans, I think the ones 40s, 50s, and 60s, became powerless to do anything. And it was sad because I think they recognized what had happened to their country. But they were powerless by the time the brown shirts and the Nazis got into control. They were powerless to do anything and were going to be killed if they put up any resistance. So the grandfathers and the older people just had to stay there and take it.
As you're listening to her testify, and part of her background was she was in a concentration camp in France first, and then was shipped out. Was there a sense of revulsion? Could you, for example, you're in the gallery, and at the same time you have a wonderful view of the 21 defendants.
Yeah.
And so this is probably the first time your eyes are
watching them,
and you see Hermann Goering. What's your reaction?
Well, I think they were all, how should I say, so accustomed to what they'd been doing that they'd heard all of this before, and it was just a matter of time that before maybe they'd be put to death. And so it was kind of a so what as far as their reaction to go, or they weren't arguing, or they were not allowed to speak, and you know, to say that wasn't true. So I just kind of got the feeling that it was a done deal, but we had to make it public for the world to know and properly to, what should I say, prosecute them for what they had done. But they didn't seem to be bothered by it. They just sat there and were doing their own thing.
Do any of those characters jump out at you as you close your eyes now and you think of Goering or Hess or anybody that said, my gosh, now I see what this guy looks like, having read about him? This probably was your first experience to see them.
My first time seeing them. I had not seen them in any of their rallies. I hadn't been around the rallies or anything. I guess the things I'd heard about them, yeah, the pictures, few pictures we'd seen, they were in fact the average individuals as far as their looks go, and but I didn't have anything except what I heard was powerful enough. I decided I wouldn't eat lunch that day, and having heard it once, I figured if I went back some more, all I would continue to hear was the same thing. So I don't think I went back any other times to sit in the gallery to what was happening, to listen to it.
You weren't alone. This is the postscript of her testimony that day. And it was, as it was done, they describe it, the New York Herald Tribune described it, the courtroom was hushed at valiant Courtier's testimony. For some, it was simply too much. The Tribune went on to say that on hearing about the atrocities, some of the defendants removed their headphones and they failed to listen to any more. This was sort of their highlight. So it sounds like you had probably an experience similar.
Similar.
Yeah. Anything specific that you recall that during the course of the testimony that said, that's revolting? Anything it did?
No, except no. I can imagine the, what should I say, the dismay and the horror of the people living around the area when you could smell the ovens burning day and night, and to see the cars coming into a dead end track end filled with people and leaving empty. There wasn't any way that could be hidden.
Right.
And I just imagine the community around wondered when it was going to stop.
When you left that day, or even had a chance to go back to your communications area, did you have a reason to talk to your colleagues and say, gee, you won't guess what happened to me today?
I don't remember talking to him, but I'm sure I did. I don't remember if any of the rest of them went into the, or not, to observe it. I don't remember having strong discussions with him about it. One of the asides that I did learn was I was down in the communications room the day that the telegram came in from our American investigator, who went back to Rommel's home to investigate the report that Rommel had been poisoned on the way back to Munich, and confirmed that Rommel had that a car arrived with several German officers, said they gave him a couple hours with his family, and that he had to report into Munich by car. He was in southern Germany, so he said goodbye to his family and got in the car and arrived at a German hospital in Munich, and he was dead on arrival. And I think he knew that he had been caught, because he was, I think, an honorable general. My understanding was that in his early days in the German army, he had training at Fort Knox with our armored forces, and tactics with tanks and so forth. And he was didn't like what was happening, and I think he was in the leadership of a group to try to overthrow the government. And I think haven't read a lot about it, but they caught up with him and found out he was a great general. And I think in terms of war and honor, he was an honorable man, and he just couldn't take it anymore. It was just too much for him. It wasn't the way to do things. And I think he probably recognized the war was lost. It was just a matter of time. When you get a country like Germany surrounded with several 100,000 Allied soldiers coming, including Russians, from all directions, there there wasn't any way they could survive, and it was just a matter of time.
Where did you stay in Germany? What was your housing?
Well, when we stayed, we were in hotels mostly. I always had opportunity to stay in hotels in Mariansky Lozny or Marienbad. We were in the that was it, the Weimar Hotel, which was at the head end of a hill. King of England, or the English royalty, I understood, had been there. It was a very nice hotel. We stayed there. Then, when I was thinking, when I got out of the war trials and ended up in, I left the war trials and ended up in northeastern Germany, where we were adjacent to the Russians in the occupied zone. Coburg, town was Coburg. And it had been a summer retreat for Hitler. So when we got to Coburg, we were also in a hotel, communications, switchboard stuff. We were told to carry our arms all the time. So we had a loaded carbine. I found legally, I understand, a chrome-plated .45, which was beautiful, but not chrome-plated inside the barrel. It was operational, functional. Because we were in wire work up and down telephone poles along the DMZ, or between the Germany and the Russian zone. And we also were told the people in Coburg were not friendly. We walked in twos in the middle of the street. This is in '46, because we didn't want to be shot at. And so things were kind of iffy. We were armed at all the time. And we had a company ready to go at all times from our company. And so I was working switchboard. And things got kind of iffy, because one day on the switchboard I got a call and it says, "Operator, this was an American." First of all, the occupation was Americans backed up with Germans. When we left, Germans were in place and the Americans were backed up. But this soldier called from, I forget what the post number was, and he said, "I've been shot." I said, "You've been shot?" He said, "Yeah, a Russian sniper picked me off." "Where?" I said, "In the knee." And he says, "I need help." So I called the Ready Company. The Ready Company went out, the captain went out, notified them. They sent an ambulance out, picked him up, brought him back, took him to the hospital. Our then battalion commander came in and found out what happened. He says, "I'll meet with the Russian commander the next day," which he did. There were a couple of places where you could meet. When he came back, I'm in the squad room listening to all of this. He says, "The Russian commander said the soldier will be found and shot that day. That'll take care of that." So we didn't have friendly relations between these people. Sunday afternoon, I got a call. It was funny. And the guard, American guard, says, I said, "Where are you?" He says, "I'm standing behind my guardhouse." And I said, "Why?" He said, "There's a wounded Russian on the motorcycle driving up and down looking for the German." We were now in reserve and the Germans were on the front line. He'd crossed the line and a German had shot at him, German guard, and eventually he went back across the line. Well, this was in the spring of '46. I'm now getting ready. I have enough time, enough points to come home. So we were in quarters there. We were in a hotel, nice quarters, had good mess, occupation forces, and but I say we're armed, and it was a pretty time. So eventually we went up to oh dear, north of Berlin to what was the port I told you? Oh gosh. I should have remembered the port. I'll think of it. Anyhow, to embark and come back to the States. And so we processed through at a German air base and got aboard the Blue Ridge Victory, which was a C3 hull, steam turbine driven, about 20 knots versus the 10 knots we came over on. We had about 1,500 troops on board, and they converted all of the all of the cargo area to bunks, 4 high welded bunks, and one of the center areas over the hatch had a mess gear, and so we had mess on board. And we were able to leave. We got back to New York in 8 days. I got to know the engineer. I found the way down to the engine room, and I went down to the engine room and talked with the engineer, and he was very unhappy. We had some rough seas, and we were only drawing about 19 feet of water. Normal load line is about 28 feet of water. So I had all the ballast on board we could load, but the screw would come out of the water and chomp, chomp, chomp back in the water, and the engineer would have to go back, and the single shaft, 18-inch diameter shaft, and about a 16-foot diameter propeller, the lubrication of the bearing were oak wood blocks around the bearing, and they would vibrate loose. And he'd go back with a sledgehammer and pound the blocks back in the bearing because screw coming out of the water. But the skipper wouldn't back off. We had, I think, 30 of the 32 jets on the turbines open, steam turbine, beautiful ship. So we got back in 8 days, and back into New York Harbor, and came by the Statue of Liberty. We docked in New Jersey, and then we went by ferry. I don't know why. Oh, we went from ferry up one of the rivers to a train station where we could offload to a train, and went to Fort Dix. And so we're discharged in Fort Dix.
Back to Nuremberg just for a few minutes. Did you have any chance to interface with the prosecution staff at all in your role? Did you meet any of did you ever see Jackson? Did you ever?
Well, I saw him from the balcony, and I don't recall that, no, I didn't. If I'd been one of the comm officers, I probably would have had contact with them in the sense of what they needed for communications. But I was a T5 technician, 5th grade, and I didn't have a lot of rank, so I didn't get around to see anybody much.
How did the project work when you're in the communications area and somebody wanted to call London? I mean, they would go through your office and you would literally do all the switching?
They would dial up and say, operator, I want London or I want Moscow. I'm so-and-so. I think they would identify who they were. And we would plug the line in and ring London. And London board would give them the Admiralty or wherever they were going to talk to. But we had direct lines, direct communications to, as I said, Zurich, Paris, London, and Moscow.
Why not United States? Why not Washington?
Well, because that was landline out of England, so they could plug them through. I said she had a line for England, or for America, but I didn't have the rank to do that.
So let's assume, for the sake of argument, somebody in the prosecution staff wanted to report back to Washington. They would go through
our board
into London, and then London into...
London would dial Atlantic cable, and wherever it terminated, military someplace, they would plug into Washington. They would direct line that way. We're talking 1944, 45, 46.
And for the folks that were going to London, Zurich, and if it was the Russian prosecution wanted to talk to Moscow, they'd go through your board. And
our board was the central communication. Locally, for all of the mess, the motor pool, and all of the guard people, and I'm sure there were lots of clerks doing all this legwork around the side. But ours was central communication, central comm. We were right outside the Palace of Justice.
Did you have a chance to fraternize at all with the Germans?
We had a couple of times. They had a couple of halls. They liked to do the not square dance.
Polka?
Polka. They like to do the polka. And they did the polka in Nuremberg. We had a rec hall. We had Red Cross personnel. They came in with motion pictures, and we saw same motion pictures times over. It was interesting. One with Burgermeister's daughter was silent film in color, and it was a fascinating film. A carriage with a copper bathtub on it, fell off a carriage going through a field, and it was taken into the town, and the burgomaster was the mayor's daughter, got to take baths in it. And the men of the village found out where she was taking baths, also their wives, so they put burnt cork around the hole that the men were looking at. And
A little risque back then, huh?
and they would show up at the pub with the cork around their eye, not knowing it was there. The wives took them home. But this was our understanding of the burgomaster's daughter, because there's no text and no bylines. It was funny. So yes, we did. And then when I got up in the Coburg and a couple of other places, there were some local Saturday night dances and so forth. We went to them. They were friendly people. But not too much, because Nuremberg, I think, understood the city was several 100,000. Those that survived were left. 80,000 people left the city, so there was no one in the city.
Did the Germans have a sense of what was going on at the trial?
I think so.
What was that sense?
I think, as I say, I think there was enough information leaking back to the public that the public not involved in the military knew what was happening and knew who had done what, and there was enough side talk with not just one concentration camp, but what was it, 20 or 30 of them?
Oh, many, yeah.
All over, that there was enough groundswell feeling that things weren't right. I don't know, I didn't talk to any of them. The only one we talked to, I said, was in the house that we occupied, going up to the front, but they seemed to be amenable to the Americans, and we were when we could, we'd give them coffee and things they didn't have. Yeah. So there was a kindness toward all the people that weren't involved. Our Americans were, really, really great guys taking care of people. And so I think the German populace, well, as I said, understood that. When getting back to the occupation, that's when we were the governor of Germany. Lucius Clay was the governor of Germany for 2 years. Right. We had a military occupation government. There was no burgomaster, who was the mayor. There was no police. We provided the telephones. We left our telephone communications with them. There was no postal service. The trains were destroyed, so there was no communications. So the infrastructure of the country was bare. There was nothing. And so our military government provided normal police protection, a basic court system. Probably we printed money. I think there was money printed for them. So our American government gave Germany 2 years of government life, until the people who were the old guys who were the postmasters got out of the army and came back. Many of the older people were in the army. When they came back to their hometowns, then they were integrated back into the government. They weren't the ones that had been the Nazis. The Nazis were a small element governing all the rest of them, but the thousands of Germans who survived came back to their villages.
While you're on the board, could you listen in to what they're saying?
Occasionally I did, not often. I did up in Pilsen. I listened in, which was strictly illegal for me to do that, but so I was careful what I listened to. But I picked up a few tidbits, yeah. But I didn't listen to any of the trial information, as I remember. Pretty careful.
You're back in the States, and all of a sudden, October 1st, 1946 arrives, and you open up the newspaper and you see the verdicts, the judgments at Nuremberg. Did you have any reaction, having been there?
No, I didn't really. I guess if I did, I figured probably justice had been done. There was enough evidence of what they had done that that they should be punished for it. I didn't know what, the punishment should be, but it was crimes against humanity, and it just wasn't a few thousand people. It was millions involved. and it couldn't be hidden, and it needed to be taken care of. So I didn't have any thoughts one way or the other then. I was working on finishing up a bachelor's and working on a master's at Cornell, and I did find in the stacks a note about the fact that the German generals who had been exchanged, which we did innocently in Pilsen, I think it was innocently in Pilsen, we exchanged the German generals, or Russian generals, back to the Russians in back of Pilsen. I say the back on the east side at night. And I heard that on the telephone, which I shouldn't have, but I did. I wasn't sure what had happened until I got to Cornell, got back in the stacks, and found a New York Times issue with a note that said General so-and-so and so-and-so had been found something or other as traitors to their country and were executed.
Sure. So the Americans handed them back to the Russians.
We handed them back to them, but what could we have done? It was hard to tell what to do.
Right.
There are 3 divisions coming to us, and we were accepting them as surrender. And at that time, we were partners, or whatever you want to call it, with the Russian government. So, yeah, we gave them back to them. But it was kind of touchy. So I came home with not too good a feeling to the Russians, and people around me were saying, "Oh, but they're great. They helped us win the war." And I said, "No, I'm not sure about that."
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't. And people thought I was a number 10, a nut, you know. But I'd had enough experience in the occupation up in Coburg and around that they were reading off a different book.
Right. Back to your one day at the Nuremberg trial, there is a very famous photo of that day and that lady where she actually is shown standing up, showing 2 things. One is her tattoo that she was given. Another is one showing that there were dog bites because she was part of an experiment in the concert. Do you have any recollection of that at all? Would you have been there and seen that part of it?
I probably was there for it. I don't remember that. I remember other information I'd read later about their freezing people and all of their experiments were. I don't remember that specifically, but it was, as you say, it was a powerful day, and she wasn't afraid to speak up.
Yeah. As it turned out, she was perhaps one of the most powerful eyewitnesses of the whole trial, and you were there, as Edward R. Murrow would say.
By accident, I didn't pick out the day, not knowing what the schedule was, and I don't think there was. I didn't see a published schedule of who was doing what each day, in terms of which country was prosecuting and who was reporting on it. So they probably didn't do it, and I wasn't connected that way in with it. So it was just per chance that I was able to go in that day.
She was referred to as the most dramatic witness during the French prosecution. In fact, during the course of her testimony, again, you may not have been there for the whole thing, but she described the process of selecting those who were sent to the gas chambers and the medical experiments performed on inmates. In both activities, the name of Dr. Joseph Mengele appeared in the trial record for the very first time. So you probably didn't know it at the time, but you were there when the name Dr. Mengele shows up, the angel of death, as they refer to him. So yeah, you were there at a pretty interesting day in the history of the Nuremberg trials.
Well, just to be there, when you look back on history, it was anybody could have been there, but I was one of probably had a dozen operators. It didn't take a lot. We were on a shift, 4 hours on and maybe a day off or so. So there were a dozen or so of us, maybe even fewer, who were there for at least 3 or 4 months of it. So considering all of the millions who were involved in the whole activity, I was pretty fortunate to be there for that period.
Well, while you were there, was there any sense of history happening, or were you looking at the number of days until you had points and you were heading home?
I wasn't a history major, and I wasn't. I've since then learned to like history, but I felt it was a crucial time in the life of the world. Really, I wasn't agitating that much to get home or unhappy operating the switchboard. I kind of felt fortunate to be able to do that. And I had a switchboard that I could talk to 4 capitals in the world. Just plug in and ring them. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was pretty neat for me. So I enjoyed that aspect of it. And I wanted to get home, but I knew the fellows who had been away for 2 or 3 years who had gone home certainly deserved to, and I would have eventually. And there was a period there when we were thinking about the Pacific War, which hadn't drawn to a close yet, and so there was some thoughts of that. But I figured I was busy where I was, and I wasn't probably going to get sent to the Pacific War, so that didn't bother me.
What question haven't I asked? The one you say, gee, I wish Greg would ask this one.
Oh, you covered just about everything that I've heard.
Are you curious about anything you want to ask him?
Yeah, I'm sort of curious about the living quarters and how many people were in your unit and how many officers were in charge of your unit.
Yeah, we had, obviously there was a comm officer. We were in the Palace of Justice. It was like a dormitory. We had, I think, there were 3 of us in a room, and then latrines or bathrooms down the hall. We had a central mess. Of course, there was a lot of technical support, and in cars and jeeps and transportation. And I think we had a medical unit nearby. But it was, what was the comm officer? I don't remember the comm officer's name. But not having today's communications, wires were the main communication. Telephone was, not having radio. Someplace somebody had radio, but that wasn't there at Nuremberg. So it was mainly hard line, very close guards with passes to get in. There wasn't nobody from the Daily News walking in to take a picture. It was very, very controlled environment. Needed to be, had to be. And we had outside of town, I don't know if it was an armored division, but we had armed troops outside of town ready for something if there was an uprising of some kind. There was always that feeling that the Germans weren't happy with being beaten down. We weren't sure if something was going to come back at us. We had a lot of them escape. They could have come back somehow for a last minute stand. So it was kind of it was not an electric feeling, but it was a serious feeling about what was happening in the environment. It was closely guarded.
Did you live right in the Palace of Justice?
Yep. Yep.
And how many Americans do you think had soldiers
were there? Oh, we probably had, just a wild guess, probably maybe 75 or 100.
Did you share meals with these other soldiers? Or?
Yeah, well, if you look at the pictures, there was a guard on each cell, so there were many, many military policemen around. I'm trying to think where our mess hall was. It was probably downstairs. But we had a common mess. They brought in GI food. Well, GI food, a government issue. But there were probably 100 people in a building.
Would people talk about the trial of the day, or was it more?
There wasn't a lot of discussion that way. I don't remember if we had a day room for pool or not. I know we were doing extra things. We could walk through town. A couple of my friends were collecting stamps. The German post office issued stamps for almost all of the war, or up to toward the end of the war, and they were stamp collectors, and they were collecting stamps. I didn't get the value of them, and I don't know whether they sold them, but I know what they were doing. They were buying complete sheets of stamps, all values, baking powder, not baking powder, but talcum powder, dusting, putting them in layers, and they were shipping them back home. You know, stamp collectors would probably be, got to get them. But I wasn't that much that endeavor. I don't know. It wasn't illegal. They were buying them to send home, but they were busy doing that. I'm trying to remember. I guess I did book reading. I wasn't a drinker. If we had a bar, I didn't go to the bar. We had a day room. We had a, as I say, there were dances. I went to some of the dances, polkas and stuff. The town was open in that sense, what people there were.
Would you go to any of the churches or synagogues?
No, I didn't do that. Of course, most of Nuremberg was leveled, so there wasn't much there. I was trying to think if we had chapel services. I know we had a chaplain. I probably went to them, but I've forgotten a lot of that if I did. I don't know if I wrote to Ann about going to. Did I write to chapel?
We're going home and looking for the letters. You have a Nazi flag somewhere, I think, in the house.
Yeah, I've got a Nazi flag. I've got some memorabilia.
And how long were you in Nuremberg?
From, what did I say, from December through January, February, March.
You came back in April, May.
March, probably March or April, because I went back to Coburg until I left. Coburg was in the spring, March and April probably. So I was there December, January, February, March, maybe 4 months.
And just what happened, the prosecution case sort of ended about the time you left. And then the defense case came on at Nuremberg. Do you follow what's going on today in international law? Is this a curiosity, having seen a little bit of Nuremberg?
I haven't up to this point, but I will. I have an engineering degree and a public administration degree, and in that I had 12 hours of government, 10 hours of constitutional law, so I'm a bit familiar with it, but I like law, and I'll pick it up as one of my reading items. I haven't been that close to it, but living in the Washington arena, not much escapes you.
That's right. A bunch of Washington is coming to Chautauqua next Wednesday, so if you're around, you'd be inundated with this international law.
Yeah.
Well, this is terrific. This is terrific. Thanks so much, Don, for pausing and reflecting on your military career, and we've just stolen an hour's worth of your time here.
Okay.
But this is terrific. You've given us a sense of what it was like to be at Nuremberg, and I've always enjoyed folks like you who've had a little part of that whole Nuremberg experience, whether the photographers, the physicians, the prosecutors, the secretarial staff. They all have this, fill in this mosaic, because it was a major operation for the Americans.
I didn't tell you the rest of the story.
This is the Korean story?
No.
Oh, okay.
When I got at Fort Dix, they were issuing what they call the ruptured duck, which was the eagle over the crest that was discharged.
Right.
So I got my ruptured duck, and an old sergeant says, "Why don't you sign up?" And I said, "What?" He says, "Sign up for the reserves." I said, "Why?" He said, "We're not going to have another war." He said, "We're sinking ships, cutting up airplanes." And I said, "Well, what's in it for me?" He said, "Well," he says, "if we have one," he says, "the time will count." So I signed up in the reserves, went to Fort Smith, Arkansas, met Ann. She said yes. We were married by my father, who was a military, who was a naval chaplain in Norfolk at Breezy Point Chapel. I went off to Tri-State College to work on my degree. I was in the reserves. For the first year, they didn't catch up with me. The next year, they did. I went to monthly training for the Army, finished my degree in aeronautical engineering, worked for 6 months for Fairchild Aircraft. She and I working for Fairchild. I had enough credit to go to Cornell to get a master's, went to Cornell. I went down to the enlistment office and Army Air Force by then and said, can I transfer to the Air Force because I have a degree in aeronautical engineering? And they said yes. I got out of the Army Reserves, transferred to the Air Force Reserves. I'm hard at work at Cornell. Along 1950 comes the Korean War. He says, whoops, whoops. I'm still in the reserves. So I rushed quickly to the ROTC office. Cornell has a large ROTC program for Army and Navy, now Air Force, and went to them and I said, I have a degree in aeronautical engineering. I'm a World War II veteran. I'm a reserve. Can you use me? He said, yes, they could. I discharged from the reserves. I became an ROTC cadet officer. On June, I think it was 11th, I got my master's degree at 11 o'clock, and 1 o'clock I'm sworn in the Air Force, a second lieutenant, and called to active duty and put 20 years in the Air Force. So wow. The time that the old sergeant said you ought to have counted, and I came in the Air Force with 8 years of service.
My gosh.
So finally retired from the Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel, Air Force, retired in 71.
Well, Paul Harvey would be proud of you.
That's the rest of the story.
Wow. Well, thank you. Children? Family?
4 children. A daughter, the oldest, 3 sons, all have college degrees. 8 grandchildren, each having 2 girls, no grandsons. All very gainfully employed. One oldest son has bachelor's and 2 masters. The others have bachelor degrees. And 2 from University of Richmond, 1 from Virginia Tech, and 1 from West Virginia Wesleyan.
Perfect. Perfect.
My father died in 2003, retired Methodist minister, 43 days short of 102. Mother and he are buried in Arlington Cemetery.
And you're at Chautauqua and going to soon become more of a Chautauquan than you probably ever expected.
Probably.
Welcome, and thank you so much to both of you for coming, and thanks for the...
It was a treat for us, thank you.
The peanut gallery here, this is terrific.
So now you've got it on tape, I guess.
Yeah, we do. This is terrific, thank you.